So it is that time of year again where we recap the year previous and talk about the hits and the shits. And this year, as with every year, we are going to be starting with my shit list. Now this is actually going to be a combination of two videos that I made last year, which is my worst of the year and also my DNFs. I've decided to combine them this year because I just don't want to spend more time than necessary talking about the things that I didn't like. And also I am going to be replacing that DNF video with a kind of second best of the year. So the next video you're going to see on this channel is going to be my top 5 best books of 2022, followed by a list of 10 honorable mentions, which are very high 4-star reads that live in my mind rent-free but just didn't quite get 5 stars. So 2022 overall was not the best reading year for me. I was just mentally checked out for a lot of it, and what that has resulted in is not a great deal of amazing reads, but also not a great deal of terrible reads either, because to be quite honest, my main issue in 2022 is that I was just not feeling passionately about anything. So these books are a handful of the 2-star reads that I had throughout the year. You will see in my stats video that will come a little bit later in the month, like a total breakdown of like every rating for 2022, as well as a bunch of like other stuff. But these are a selection of my 2-star reads that I feel most passionately about. So if I don't like a book, that doesn't mean that it's going to end up on my worst of the year list. These are books that I have a personal vendetta against. Like, these books offended me. So we are actually going to be starting off with the books that I did not finish. I never used to be big on DNFing, but the energy I want to bring forward into 2023 is focusing on what I love. And if I don't love something, just cut it, because there's something else out there that I am actually going to enjoy that I should be spending my time on. This might not be all of my DNFs as well. I have been asked how I track these. I literally just have a note on my phone where every time I DNF a book I put it in here, but that obviously has margin for error and sometimes I'll just forget. But the first book that I DNF'd was Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames, and I was actually very upset about this one because this is about a bunch of like has-been mercenaries who are getting the band back together to find the daughter of one of them. So they're all like, they're has-beens, they're past it, like they shouldn't be doing this anymore, but they're doing it for the sake of their friend, and they go on this adventure through this very dangerous forest to find the kidnapped daughter, or the daughter that's in trouble. I really wanted to love this, I really thought I would, but I didn't like the humor, and it is a humorous read, unfortunately. So if you're not gelling with the humor, there's a big chance that, like me, you won't enjoy this. It was also kind of fast-paced, kind of flippant, definitely falls into the valley of fun reads, and as we know, I don't like fun. I would rather read something really serious and depressing than something that's supposed to be a good time. Like, it's just, a good time is not a good time for me. I then DNF Justice of Kings. I think that the author for this one is Richard Swan. This one was one of my Goldsboro reads. I didn't like the tone of this one, which is very hard to describe. I can't even tell you what it's about. I think it was about a traveling like magister and his assistant is like telling his life story. There was a murder mystery going on in here, and I felt like the tone was very Agatha Christie but fantasy world, and that's just not something that I'm looking for in a fantasy. I know what I like in fantasy, and what I'm learning is that I can very quickly identify like if it's just not going to be for me based on the tone, and this was one of those instances. So I know a whole bunch of people have liked this, but just with the tone and the direction that the plot was going in, I knew it just wasn't going to be one for me. I also DNF'd another Goldsboro book, which was Absinthe by, is it Brendan P. Bellicourt? This one I was very dubious about from the beginning. This one is set in the 1920s, and it has like, absinthe is like it's a drug more than it is an alcohol. This felt like a gangster movie. It felt very like manly book for men, like a 1950s or 1920s gangster shootout fantasy sci-fi situation that is just not something that I enjoy. So I noped out of this one pretty quickly as well, and I have absolutely zero regrets. One that I was also really sad that I didn't like was LOreal by Garth Nix. I read Sabriel, didn't love it, persevered into LOreal, and decided to call it quits. This is the second book in the Old Kingdom series, which is like a classic YA fantasy series that a bunch of people love. Each book follows a different character, and then later books revisit some of the characters from earlier books. But Sabriel is about a girl who is a necromancer, and well, her father's a necromancer, and she gets a package, like somebody brings her a package of his equipment, and she finds out that he is actually stuck in this limbo place between life and death. So she sets off to rescue him, but she's been brought the equipment so that she can take up his job of being the abortion, which is a necromancer that kind of like keeps the dead in check. This had a tone that reminded me a lot of things like The Book of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a classic fantasy series that I do not love. I didn't like the narrator, which I know is a bit of a controversial opinion. There's just like he has a nasally tone that I don't like, especially when we're dealing with like female main characters, and especially the voice that he did for Sabriel I found to be especially grating. So yeah, sadly, once again, tonally this was just not one for me, although I can kind of see why other people really like it. I also DNF'd Wild and Wicked Things by Francesca May. This one is a sapphic fantasy that is set in the 1920s. My main issue with this is that there was nothing grounded in it in the 1920s other than the synopsis that told me that it was set there. My thing that I enjoy about the 1920s is the air of like glitz and glamour and flappers, and we were leaning into that vibe as we were following a girl who had moved into a house. I think she was moving to the place where her father was from to feel close to him after he passed away, and she moves into this house that's next door to a house that throws loads of parties. So I was expecting the glitz and glamour of the 1920s within that kind of element, but I just found the lack of description in this book took away any kind of compulsion I had to read it, because the thing that I was really hoping for was that glitz and glamour, and without the description this could have been set in any kind of time period, which was just really bizarre to me why you would then choose to set it in the 1920s. So I DNF'd this one about 120-ish pages in. And then my final, I think, DNF of the year was The Witch's Blade by A.K. Mulford. This one is the second book in the Five Crowns of Ocrith series, which is a fantasy romance series that, well, once again, each book follows a different character. So the first book is following this red witch whose kingdom has been destroyed, and a fae prince comes to her and asks her if she will help him to re-establish her kingdom and find the missing heir of the fae family that ruled in this country like once upon a time. So she agrees and they go off together. It's a romance between those two, but it's very fast paced. It's not a very big book, the first book in this series, and it's very fast paced, which, as we've just discussed, not typically my favorite, especially when we're talking about something like romance where I want it to be a little bit slower and more like character building. So I did read the first book. I gave it 3 stars. It was a good time, but it didn't blow me away, and I went on into the second book to see if I liked that one any better, and I didn't. There was just a lack of interest based on the fact that the tone and the pace and the style of the story was just not something that I enjoyed. So I just decided that I would be wasting my time if I continued. So those were my DNFs. Now for my worst books of the year. We do only have 5, and like I said, these are not just any old 2-star did not enjoy. I had no 1-star read, so that's a good thing, but these aren't just like any old didn't like this book. This is personal. I don't like these for personal reasons. So they are in order. We will be going with my least favorite book of the year right at the top, but the first one that I would like to talk about coming in at number 5 is not this. This is the wrong volume. So coming in at number 5, we have Rat Queens Volume 8, The God Dilemma. This is a comic series that started off so strong and just completely ran itself into the ground. So this one is a high fantasy comic series. It's adult and it's following 4 boozy battle maidens for hire who have gotten into one bar fight too many. So to get out of jail, they have to perform quests for the realm to earn their freedom. Something that I really loved about the earlier volumes of this was just generally the characters and the sisterhood that they had. I liked the inclusion of some of the characters that come along later on. The art style changes quite frequently. We have different artists working on here. Some I do prefer more than others, but once again, while that was disappointing, I didn't hate it. But then somewhere throughout here, we really just lost the storyline. I think it's volumes 4 and 5 or 5 and 6 are just completely different from each other, and it is kind of intentional with the way that the plot goes. But halfway through this series, because it's very much kind of like swords and sorcery, each volume is an additional quest, and then halfway through we start to introduce a main plot line that like just waxes and wanes throughout final half of this, to the point where like you kind of forget that there is a main plot line because they diverge from it so much. My main issue with this is that the entire thing that these like 4 volumes have been building up to just kind of disappears and resolves off page, and what you actually see in this last comic is just not interesting. I feel like they really just ran themselves into the ground with this comic. They wanted to end it. There's something right at the end of here that implies that there will be more from Rat Queens in the future. I can tell you guys that I'm not going to be reading it because this just, it started off so strong and this was abysmal. This final volume just felt like they wanted it to be over with so that they could move on to other things because they knew it was bad. At number 4, we have one that really upset me at the time, but as time has gone on, I just don't think about it because it was very upsetting. But that is The Name of All Things by Jen Lyons. So this is the second book in an adult high fantasy series. I mean, the books are pretty long, so it's pretty epic. I think it's 5 books in total. And in the first book, we're following this guy called Kieran. And while the story itself was faster paced than I would typically like from adult high fantasy, the first book was so uniquely told that I was immediately sucked into it. So we're following this boy called Kieran who is in a prison cell and he's with this monster, and the monster asks him to tell her a story. So he asks what story, and she asks for his life story. So he starts to tell it, and after a chapter she stops him and she says that he's starting in the wrong place, and she goes back to an earlier point in time and starts telling the story from much earlier on. So the chapters alternate with each of them telling Kieran's story, Kieran telling it in first person while the monster tells it in third person, until they eventually catch up to each other and the storyline progresses. Now this is a little bit confusing in that we have a lot of moving parts in this series. There's gods, there's god kings, there's dragons, I think there's 8 of everything, and there's people who have been reincarnated as other people, people who are in the bodies of people that they shouldn't be, people who are thought to have been killed but are actually very much alive, and it's very confusing, but in a way where I feel like Jen Lyons knows exactly what's going on. She's got one of those like crazy like crime charts where she knows everything that's happening, and that it's all, I guess, gonna become clear later on. So what I wanted after the confusion of book 1 was for the story to continue from that point after we'd had this very interesting, unique start to the story. But The Name of All Things was exactly the same as book 1 but about a different character. Now I do believe that these 2 books, books 1 and 2, are like a prequel, and then book 3 they kind of join together and then it goes on. But my motivation to continue this series was so low after this book that I still have not carried on. And while there's a whole lot going on in this series, the crux of the matter is that Kieran can either make or break the world. He has the potential to go either way, which was incredibly interesting to me. And this was just in a different part of the world, following a different character. It made the unique writing style seem a little bit more like a gimmick, and yeah, I wasn't a fan. So I will continue this series eventually. I have been told that if book 3 once again is not enjoyable to me, then I should pretty much cut my losses there, so that's probably what I'm gonna do. I have this one in at number 3, but it could be anything between 3 and 1, because while I would say objectively it's not the worst book, in fact some people like this book, some people like all of these books I imagine, but this one especially, there's a lot of people who like this book. I hated it, but while it's not objectively the worst book that I read, it is probably the one that I'm the saltiest about, which is The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the second era of Mistborn. I did not foresee a reality where I didn't love this book, because I have not given any Brandon Sanderson book less than 3 stars, and the one book that I have given 3 stars wasn't a Cosmere novel, it was one of the Skyward novels. So I thought that I was gonna love this one, and I was so wrong. Mistborn as a series has multiple eras. We have 2 that are completed so far, and the first era is following a guy called Kelsier who is putting together a group of people to overthrow this evil overlord of the final empire. So this is the first book in the second era, which takes place 300 years after the conclusion of the first, and we're following a guy called Wax, who, this is a western, which I feel like is a big part of my issue with it. I was nervous about it being a western going in, I was rightfully nervous because I don't like it. But we're following this guy called Wax, who has been a lawmaker in the, I think they're called the Roughs, which is essentially the Wild West, for the last however many years. However, his uncle has died and there's no lord to take over his family estate. So he returns home to the city, Elendel, and he's trying to fit back into high society. However, he's really struggling to let go of his past, and he finds out about a series of train robberies where hostages are being taken, and he decides to look into it along with his sidekick Wayne, who follows him home from the Roughs. I hated everything about this aside from the way that the characters from First Era are represented and woven into this world, and one kind of part of the epilogue, which was the first point when reading this book where I felt like this had a purpose, because this series is an integral part of the Cosmere. Like, big things happen later on in this series that is super crucial to the Cosmere as a whole, which is an extended universe that I am like deeply invested in. But this just felt like a fun dude bro jaunt. I hated the writing style. It felt very much to me like Skyward, in that Brandon Sanderson changes his writing style occasionally to appear like, I don't know, funnier, more relatable, more lighthearted. And I just find it super unnecessary, because in the terms of Skyward, like, yes, it's young adult, but Brandon Sanderson's writing style is not inaccessible. It's the worlds and the level of complexity within the plot and the magic system that makes Brandon Sanderson dense, if he even is dense, which in a lot of ways I really don't think he is, because his writing style is so accessible. I hated the representation of female characters in here, very much damsel in distress. And while not every female character has to be a warrior to be strong, what I don't appreciate is, I guess, female characters being the damsel in distress just so that they can establish themselves as being strong later on, if that even is the aim of this series. I hated the gunfights. There's nothing less interesting to me than a gunfight, and that's actually one of the main reasons why I DNF'd Absinthe, because we got to like a shootout in a speakeasy and I was just like, this is not for me, and note out of that real quick. And I just don't care for the Western setting, so sadly it was a flop on 95% of the fronts. I'm just salty about it because I thought I was gonna love this. I did not foresee me hating this, and I just want to get through Second Era and Mistborn as quickly as possible so that I never have to revisit. Although I do believe I have been told that there are quite a lot of people who don't like this book, and the series does like get a little bit better, so I do have hope. Coming in at number 2, we have Realmbreaker by Victoria Aveyard. Another colossal disappointment to me, because I love the Red Queen series. I read Red Queen for the first time. I've read it multiple times, but I read it for the first time in 2015 when it was first published. And it is kind of a dystopian, but it also has a lot of like high fantasy elements in. And at the time, it was my first like conscious foray into high fantasy as a book. I adored it, and I adored that series, and I still do. Nostalgic favorite. Don't know how I feel about it now, but I love it so much. So when Victoria Aveyard was going to be writing a multi-perspective high fantasy story, I was hyped to pick it up, but this was so boring. So from what I can remember, this is set in a world where there are they twins? There were twins, and one of them was taken to be the chosen one, and the one who was like 10 minutes younger was kind of discarded and took to be raised elsewhere. And there are spindles in this world, which are portals into different dimensions. So because the youngest twin resents being the youngest twin, he decides that he's going to rip open all of the spindles so that the dimension like collapses in on itself. And the twin who's the chosen one goes to meet his brother to try and stop him from doing it. However, he dies, and the two survivors from this battle ride off to their respective countries, and they ask their countries for help. But nobody wants to help because they're like, not my problem, not gonna happen, don't care if it happens, that kind of situation. So these two people who are survivors start to put together a band of people who actually do care, like a band of heroes. They need somebody of the same blood as this hero, so they find them, and a couple of people come along the way to help them close down, or at least attempt to close down, these spindles that the bad guy's ripping open. I only cared about the villains in this book. The heroes were just completely flat to me. For a story like this to work, I feel that you have to care about the characters, or the plot has to be really clever and intricate. This felt like a really slow slog with a bunch of boring characters that I didn't care about, where nothing really happens in the plot. It's just a really long prologue. If you want to read a book like this that has a multicast of characters, kind of once again Lord of the Rings style, where you have a bunch of people who are going on a journey to accomplish something, I'd recommend The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This did not do it for me. It was very Arthurian as well, I felt, in tone and setting slash style, which in theory, I love The Legend of King Arthur, but in reality, anything that's close to it or any retelling I've read or anything remotely similar, it's not a hit with me. I don't like it. And finally, some of you guys who know what's up will know that this is my worst book of the year, and that is, well, there's two books, same series, Zodiac Academy by, I don't know, Caroline Peckenham and Susan Valenti, maybe. I was told that this was it. I was told that this was hot shit. I was told that this was the one. This was so bad. It was so bad. I feel like series like this is why some people are scared of picking up indie published, like self-published books, because it's not even objectively passable. It's bad, like at the core of it, grammatically, logistically, it's bad. And I don't say that lightly. Obviously everybody is entitled to their own opinion. If you like this series, then I'm happy for you, but like I don't feel like, even the people who like it, I don't feel like you can deny that even down to the writing, the setup, the everything about this is objectively not good, and whether you enjoy it or not is separate to that. This series is a fantasy romance series about twin girls. It's like a portal fantasy, but these two girls find out that they are the heirs to the Fae. They're like Fae princesses. The parents were murdered way back when, and they end up going to this school called the Zodiac Academy where they learn about the world of the Fae. And since their parents have died and the twins went missing, a like celestial council has been put in place, and the 4 heirs to the celestial council are attending this school. So obviously they don't want to be done out of their inheritance and their birthright, so as soon as these two girls turn up, they start to make their life a living hell. This is a bully romance, but this is a bully. If somebody did to me what these boys do to these girls, I don't know how this can turn into a romance at any point with any members of these 4 boys, because some of the things that they do are not only outrageous, they are unforgivable. It's some bad shit. It's not like the bully romances that I've typically read where like things get a little bit out of hand, but like there's a line that's never crossed. These guys are stepping over that line constantly to a point where I found it uncomfortable to read. I don't care about the plot, because is there one? It's not interesting. The guy, like Seth, oh, what a creep, what a creep. There is one thing that I do like about this series, and it is the kind of direction that the relationship with one of the twins, Darcy, I think is the one, is going in, and that did intrigue me, but sadly not enough for me to read any more books in this series, because at this point I just can't overlook how bad it is. And something that really grates on me, it's super minor, but you know when you see something you can't unsee it and you can't forgive it. The shoes, like Converse, in this, like it kept being described as the main character putting on her Converses, and I'm like, Converses is not plural. If you have a pair of Converse, they're still Converse, and that will linger with me until my grave. I cannot let that go. I will never forget that, because it just really irritated me. So yeah, I am a big fan of fantasy romance. I am not a big fan of Zodiac Academy, and I kept promising that I was going to get to at least book 3, which is supposedly where this series gets good, but I decided to cut my losses because I just really didn't want to do it anymore. And actually, like from what I've seen of people reading book 8, even the stans hate that book, so I'm glad that I like noped out here. So there you have it. Those are my 5 worst books of 2022, and also these 6 books that I have DNF this year. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you liked any of these books, then I'm sorry. I'm glad that you enjoyed them. I do not mean to offend you, and I know we have discourse every year about how cruel and mean it is for reviewers to talk about things that they don't like. If that is the take that you're here to leave, then I mean, it didn't stop me from posting this video in 2018, so it's not going to stop me posting it in 2022, 2023, or any other year going forward. You know what, let's pour some tea down in my comments. Let me know your least favorite book of the year down there. The next video on my channel is going to be great because it's going to be my best of the year, followed by my 10 honorable mentions, which I am also super hyped to talk about, so do stay tuned if you are at all interested. Aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.